Public sector unions have walked away from the offer of a 8.5% pay increase over 2.5 years. They have described the offer as extremely disappointing. Paschal Donohue is the Minister for Public Expenditure. Minister, you're welcome to the show. What is your response to that accusation?
Good evening, Kieran. I'll make two quick points to you. Firstly, that we've had now over many, many years pay agreements with our public servants that have spanned a number of years, that have included all of our public servants, that I believe have worked well for respecting our public servants, for paying them to recognise their efforts while also being fair and affordable. And because of all of this, secondly, this is why we made a proposal that I do believe is very significant and valuable of €2.9 billion over just over 2.5 years, looking to deliver wage increases that would be ahead of inflation. And I would ask and really do call upon the unions at this point just to consider those proposals as we work our way through now the coming weeks.
The unions, it would seem, want there to be more of a retrospective focus in the offer. Kevin Callanan, who's the Forza General Secretary, in his statement and in his letter to members as well, his email to members sent this morning, talks about the fact that the offer put on the table by the government failed to meet the basic test of dealing with the cumulative gap between wages and inflation, amounting to almost 19% over the last 3 years. Was there ever consideration given to a retrospective?
Sure. But during that period, we had an array of supports within our economy to help everybody deal with the cost of living in terms of energy credits and the changes that we made in taxation. There were very, very few workers within this state, except those on the very lowest income, who have seen their living standards entirely protected from what has happened with the rise in prices. And there were very, very few employers, including the state, that's going to be in a position to compensate for everybody, that for the change in our living standards that we experienced due to inflation that was driven by the war and after the pandemic. But it is in recognition of the big difficulties, the higher prices of recent years, that we put a proposal on the table that actually had a rate of wage increase that was ahead of the rate of inflation across the next 2 years, recognising the big challenges and difficulties that many have faced since prices started going up.
Those cost of living measures, though generous and all as they were, they applied right across the board. So they applied to people in the private sector who could, in tandem with those measures from government, approach their employer for a pay rise, whereas those public sector workers couldn't. So there is merit in a retrospective, isn't there?
But actually there are very few employees within the private sector during those number of years who saw wage increases that were anywhere close to the very high rates of inflation that we saw. And many, many within the private sector, despite the best efforts of employers, did see wages not be able to keep up with prices because prices went up by so much. So actually there's a fairness point there in relation to this, that as we look at where we are now, what we're trying to do is deal with the difficulties of the past by putting a proposal on the table that gives wages increasing at a rate that is higher than inflation will be over the next 2 years. And public sector workers can approach their employer looking for wage increases. That's the process that we're involved in at the moment through a centralised wage agreement process.
Quite independent of inflation, there is an argument, isn't there, that we underpay our public sector workers when you look at the vacancies in the system, in the healthcare system, kind of from frontline staff to people working in child and adolescent mental health services, teacher shortages, record numbers of Gardaí leaving the force last year. I mean, the slew of positions that were created and on board Pleanála, not all filled either, and the criticism that's often made as well of our kind of glacial planning system. Part of the reason for that, I know there's a body of reform on the way, but part of the delays are the lack of staff. So when you look at all that in totality, there's an argument separate from inflation, we underpay.
But in virtually every one of those professions you've talked about, comparatively within our economy, Our public servants are well paid, versus the average wages within our economy, as they should be, because they provide do really important work within our society and our economy. And internationally, if you compare the wages that, again, we pay within our public service, they compare really well with the international average. The issue that you're referring to there, which of course you're right about, that's the feature of our economy being at full employment. That is a feature of there being so much demand for workers within our private sector. And if you look at the health service, for example, we've hired more than 22,000 extra nurses, doctors for our health service in the last 3 years. There's over 20,000 more people working in our health service. That really doesn't point to our wages being in any way uncompetitive versus what you could get elsewhere within our economy.
So do we need just the private sector to become slightly less healthy before those vacancies get addressed?
I didn't suggest that for a moment. It is a feature of the fact that we have full employment within our economy. And when you have full employment within our economy, there's a demand for workers from everybody. If you were to talk to a private sector employer, which you do regularly on your programme, Kieran, many of them would also say they have such challenges in hiring, keeping staff. I'd say it very differently. It's a feature that all employers face at the moment, whether you're in the state or the private sector. And all employers are looking at what wages they can pay in the time ahead to keep and support workers that make a difference to either the state or to the private sector, and do it in a way that's affordable and fair. And the proposals that I'm making the case for at over 2.9 billion more in pay, I believe do that.
So in an economy at full employment, we just have to accept the reality of vacancies across all those areas in the public sector, do we? Or how do you think they'll be addressed if it's not through increased pay?
By, number one, putting in place the training and the education that we are getting the people through that want to and have the training to do this work that you've referred to. And that's why Minister Simon Harris has made lots of changes in relation to higher and further university and education, to ensure that we have the supply of people who have the ability and the need and want to do different work within our economy, including within our public services. And then secondly, what we will have to do within the public service is to put in place programs and put in place support where we are able to get highly specialised talent into our public service that can make a big difference. And you mentioned on board Planola there, again, fairly, in one of your earlier questions to me, we've now been successful in really increasing the size of the number of people that are working now in on board Planola to respond back to the challenges that are there. I guess the one thing I call out as an inference there of the questions you're putting to me, could be that being at full employment, creates a lot of problems. Being at full employment means there's lots of people at work, which is the heart of having a growing economy.
The unions say that they've got finalised wording now for ballots on industrial action that they are willing to put to their members. How real a threat do you perceive that to be?
It's one I take seriously. Of course I do. We've been involved in this process now for many, many months. It's a huge pity that we were not able to get agreement early this morning in relation to it. But it's a matter for the unions themselves, how they conduct their business and how they engage with their members. What I want to do, as all of that is going on, is emphasise that industrial stability within our economy, within our country, has real value at the moment. We've been able to maintain that through a pandemic, through soaring inflation, and also make the case for the fact that a €2.9 billion proposal with wage increases that are ahead of the rate of inflation is looking to recognise the real value of our public servants, but also be fair and affordable to other workers and to our economy overall.
One of our listeners says, what's the point of putting all this effort and investment into training people for the public sector if you won't pay them properly? Matt and Laois suggests that public sector employees don't understand or appreciate how good their pension is. But this text I want to put to you, Minister, from a listener: why don't we just link public sector pay to average pay increase rates in the private sector? So a plea to bring back benchmarking.
Well, we did that once before. To put it mildly, it didn't turn out well for us. And we lost control of pay policy over a number of years. which was a contributing factor to the huge difficulty that we had then in the aftermath of the global financial crisis. So benchmarking might work for some really specialised roles within our economy, but trying to benchmark, for example, a nurse to other parts of our economy is a really, really, really difficult thing to do. We tried to do it once before, did not work out well for us. In relation to automatic benchmarking, I do think governments have to be in a position to make this decision and to be able to negotiate with union representatives on it, because every euro we spend on pay is a euro we don't spend on other things that our country also wants us to do.
Have the unions slightly got you backed into a corner, you and your government colleagues? You described the kind of the threat of industrial action as a real threat and one that you take seriously. And we've got certainly 2 elections this year, local and Europeans. There's the possibility of a general election as well. And I doubt you or any of your colleagues in Leinster House on the government benches want to be going to the polls while industrial action is ongoing.
Well, if political considerations are guiding what the unions are doing and what their leaders are doing, that's a matter for them to answer to, rather than myself. What my job is, with this DOIL lasting all the way up to February of 2025, is to be able to stand over the wage agreements that we've had in recent years that have been accepted by a majority of public sector workers, but then also to make the case for continuing to pay people well, but also in a way that is affordable and fair to the rest of the economy.
But if there's the possibility, if there's the possibility of industrial calm for a little bit more money than you're comfortable with, there's a political temptation there to grasp for it, isn't it?
Well,
given those looming elections,
there's quite a gap at the moment, Kieran, between what the proposals that we shared in the Workplace Relations Commission and the current approach of the union movement to them. We want to go back into negotiations. I do want to see if there's a way of finding agreement here and bringing about the stability that you've referred to. But it's also the case that if we come out with an agreement that is a lot bigger, with wage increases that are a lot larger than the ones I've described to you, I'll be dealing with 2 other issues after that would also have political consequences. Number one, it will mean there's less money available to do the investments, invest more in our public services in other ways than we otherwise will have. That will have a political consequence that I'll be accountable for. And number two, you'll have many, many employers within the country who will then deal with their own staff making the case for wage increases of a similar scale. And you'll have many employers that will find themselves in a position not to be able to pay for that. And that also has an impact for our country too.
Maybe, of course, you feel you've got a free hand in terms of negotiating with the prospect of looming elections, given you mightn't be running. You could be running the IMF.
Well, you've gone from me being influenced by elections coming up to you're now making the case to be not being influenced at all.
Well, I guess your colleagues might still feel the need for industrial calm, but you might say, I'm not going to be running, so I'm not going to get punished at the polls. I'll be running the IMF for about £500,000 a year.
Well, Kieran, in fairness, I've been involved in these decisions now for nearly 8 years. And at all times, I've tried to make a decision because I believe it's in the interests of our country overall and try to make the case for it. And to attribute my decision-making here to speculation about what I might do in the future or not, I don't think reflects the seriousness with which I'm approaching this. I've been working away on this process now for many months. It's the third wage agreement I've been involved in trying to negotiate. And in the other two I've done, which have been accepted by our public service workers, I think I've shown my determination to reward the great work that goes on in the public service, but to do so in a way that's affordable and fair. I'm just looking to continue that approach, Kieran.
Minister for Public Expenditure, Paschal Donohue. Minister, thanks a million for joining us here on the show.